Yeah, the offense has had some rough moments, but there's another side to this story that should have Vikings fans pretty fired up. This defense is making life absolutely miserable in practice. Young guys are starting to turn heads, and a couple of unexpected players are making a real push for bigger roles. If what we're seeing in camp carries over when the games actually count, this team could have something special cooking. So hit that like button if you're fired up for the season, and let me know you're here in the comments by dropping a SKOL. Something important is happening inside Minnesota Vikings training camp. And the biggest story may not actually be the quarterback struggles everyone keeps talking about. If you focus only on the mistakes from J.J. McCarthy or the process of Kyler Murray learning this offense, you could completely miss what those difficult practices may be telling us about the other side of the football. Because according to what has been coming out of camp, Brian Flores' defense isn't simply winning a few periods. This unit has been consistently ahead of the offense, and that could be one of the most encouraging developments of the entire summer for Minnesota. Think about the environment these quarterbacks are being asked to operate in every day. They aren't facing a basic defense designed to make training camp comfortable. They're dealing with Flores, an aggressive defensive coordinator whose system forces quarterbacks to process information before and after the snap. For McCarthy, that's an enormous challenge. And for Murray, even with his NFL experience, learning a new offensive system while simultaneously dealing with everything Flores is throwing at him can turn practice into an incredibly difficult test. That's why the quarterback results need context. Will Regatz, who has been attending Vikings training camp practices, pointed directly to this issue when discussing quarterback evaluation. His assessment was that Flores' defense has been aggressive, talented, and ahead of the offense through most of the first week and a half of camp. And his larger point might be even more significant for the Vikings season. If Minnesota can simply receive solid quarterback play, this defense could give the team an opportunity to win every single week. That changes the entire equation. Minnesota might not need its quarterback to carry the football team if this defense becomes what it currently appears capable of becoming. The original discussion even raised the possibility of Minnesota consistently winning games if the offense can simply put around 21 points on the board. Whether that exact number ultimately proves sufficient is impossible to know right now, but the underlying idea matters. This Vikings defense could potentially reduce the burden placed on the offense. And there is another reason to watch what happens when Minnesota finally faces another team. The Vikings' upcoming preseason matchup against the New York Giants could provide a completely different environment for the quarterbacks. Instead of repeatedly practicing against Minnesota's defensive starters under Flores, they could receive simpler looks against a preseason opponent. Kevin O'Connell has also been challenging his quarterbacks to absorb the offense during camp, while preseason game plans are naturally expected to be much more vanilla. So don't be surprised if the conversation suddenly changes. After days of hearing about difficult quarterback practices, Minnesota could enter preseason action and suddenly have both quarterbacks look considerably more comfortable. That wouldn't necessarily mean something magically changed overnight. It could simply demonstrate just how difficult Flores' defense has made their daily working conditions. And one player is becoming impossible to separate from that defensive success: Jalen Redmond. Redmond already established himself as an important piece of Minnesota's defense, but the reports described in this camp discussion suggest he's taken another step. His development has been remarkable considering the trajectory. He received limited action in 2024, became a full-time starter in 2025, and was described as having an outstanding season. According to the discussion, opposing offensive coaches around the NFL were even calling Redmond one of the best players on the entire Vikings roster. Now, he appears to be getting better again. During Sunday night's practice, Redmond was credited with creating the strip sack on J.J. McCarthy. The impressive part wasn't simply arriving at the quarterback. Redmond drove the pocket backward, collapsing the space in front of McCarthy and creating the disruption from the interior. That's exactly the type of play that can transform a defense. Redmond combines size with unusual athleticism, and his continued development gives Minnesota something extremely valuable in the middle of Flores's front. It also becomes even more important because there are still questions elsewhere along the defensive line. Caleb Banks wasn't participating in Sunday's practice, with the discussion suggesting Minnesota may simply be exercising caution. Levi Drake Rodriguez was characterized as another solid option, while Dominique Orange was receiving work with the first-team defense and generating positive impressions of his own. But Redmond is the established player at the center of this conversation, and his performance raises a major question Minnesota may eventually have to answer. How long can the Vikings afford to wait before discussing a new contract? The argument presented is simple. If Redmond enters the season without an extension and produces another major year, his value could rise dramatically. The discussion estimated that he might already command something around $18 million annually, and speculated that a huge season could push his future price substantially higher. Those numbers are projections, not established contract demands, but the concern behind them is legitimate. Another breakout season would give Redmond even more leverage. And yet Redmond isn't the only player forcing his way into the training camp conversation. The wide receiver room has apparently been one of Minnesota's strongest groups throughout camp. Justin Jefferson continues to look like Justin Jefferson, while Jordan Addison has impressed, and Jawan Jennings has provided a big presence working the middle of the field. Ty Felton has also generated positive reviews, while Miles Price remains involved in the return game. That leaves a fascinating fight deeper down the depth chart. The discussion identified Jashawn Jones and Silas Bolden as players involved around those final receiver opportunities. But Jones has done something particularly interesting. Minnesota has been using him as a gadget option within Kevin O'Connell's offense. During Sunday's 11-on-11 work with the first-team group, Jones received an end-around and turned it into a productive gain. He also flashed during preseason action last year, and that history matters now because every opportunity becomes critical when you're fighting for one of the final roster positions. The current projection discussed was that Minnesota could ultimately keep only 5 receivers. If that happens, the margin becomes incredibly small. The established group occupies most of those positions, meaning somebody on the outside has to create enough separation that Minnesota becomes uncomfortable exposing him to the practice squad. So far, according to this assessment, nobody has completely forced that decision. But there is one young defensive back who seems to be doing exactly the opposite. Charles Demings continues to generate positive attention almost every time another Vikings practice is completed. And what makes his story especially interesting isn't limited to what he's doing on the field. Josh Metellus revealed something about Demings that gives us a completely different picture of the rookie. Metellus said Demings constantly offers inspirational thoughts to teammates, to the point that Metellus has written several of them down. He even gave the rookie a nickname, the Prophet. That might sound like a fun training camp story until you consider what it says about Demings. This is a young player entering an NFL locker room and apparently already making an impression on veterans with his maturity and personality. Combine that with the athletic traits he's displaying on the field, and suddenly we're no longer talking about a rookie simply fighting for a roster position. We're potentially talking about someone who could eventually fight for a starting job. The expectation presented here isn't necessarily that Demings immediately starts Week 1 alongside Byron Murphy Jr., but the possibility of that changing as the season progresses shouldn't be dismissed. If we arrive in November and Demings has climbed high enough to become one of Minnesota's top 2 outside cornerback options, what we've seen during camp suggests that development wouldn't come completely out of nowhere. And this is where the defensive story becomes even more intriguing, because Demings isn't surviving against meaningless competition. He's been willing to compete against Justin Jefferson, and physically, he possesses the tools Minnesota wants at the position. Alec Lewis highlighted Demings's lateral quickness while noting the athletic background behind it. Demings was described at 6'1" and 193 pounds, with experience as a high school triple jumper and a 4.41-second 40-yard dash at the NFL Scouting Combine, despite dealing with lower body soreness. Those numbers are exciting, but numbers alone don't make an NFL cornerback. The important part is whether a player can translate explosiveness, length, and speed into functional coverage ability. According to what has been observed during Vikings camp, Demings has been doing exactly that, and that's why this defense deserves much more attention than simply using it as an explanation for quarterback struggles. Flores may have an emerging interior force in Redmond. He may have another young defensive lineman in orange earning first-team opportunities, and Minnesota may have discovered a rookie corner whose physical tools and maturity are allowing him to accelerate his development faster than expected. But there's still another rookie whose role is beginning to expand, and what Minnesota has been doing with him over the last several practices could become one of the more interesting offensive developments to follow heading into preseason action. Before we get there, I want to hear from Vikings fans. If you were making the decision today, would you try to extend Jalen Redmond before the season begins? And how much per year would you be comfortable paying him? Drop your number in the comments, because his continued rise could turn that decision into a much more expensive conversation very quickly.